At exactly 2:47 p.m. on a cold Thursday in March, Detective Ava Cooper sat in her cramped office, surrounded by a sea of cold case files, cases that had long since lost their voice. But today, one file was about to speak. Her computer screen flickered, the hum of the fluorescent lights above punctuating the stillness. Then, without warning, a notification popped up in the corner of her screen. It was a match. A 56-year-old cold case solved with a single click. The case of Ella Monroe, a 15-year-old girl who had vanished on a foggy morning in May 1972, had remained a haunting enigma for decades. A mystery that refused to die. But now, that mystery was about to unravel in the most unexpected of ways. The notification was clear. DNA match. For Ava, it was a name she never thought she'd see in connection with Ella Monroe's disappearance. A DNA match. But this wasn't just any match. This was cutting-edge forensic science. The very science that had been years, even decades, ahead of its time. And now, it had cracked open a case that had remained cold for over half a century. But there was something odd. Something that made Ava pause. Why had this match only been found now? What had been hidden in the evidence, waiting for the right moment, for the right technology to uncover it? And most haunting of all, why had this case stayed unsolved for so long? For over 5 decades, Ella Monroe's disappearance had haunted her family, her town, and the detectives who worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. But no one had ever been able to connect the dots, until now. A single breakthrough was about to change everything. The long-forgotten case of Ella Monroe was about to be solved. And what Detective Ava Cooper would discover next would shake the small town of Greensville, Michigan to its core. Before I begin, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. I'd love to know just how far this story is reaching. Detective Ava Cooper sat motionless in front of her screen, staring at the notification for what felt like an eternity. The Cody's match had come through fast. Too fast. The DNA comparison results had appeared with little fanfare, but the case number, that case number made her heart skip a beat. It didn't make sense. She leaned forward, squinting at the name on her screen. Alden Turner. The name was familiar, but not in a way that should matter here. Alden Turner had been dead for over 5 years. His death had been ruled a complication from alcohol abuse. But there was no way he could have been involved in this case. Could there be a mistake? Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to do next. She clicked through the file, her eyes scanning through the familiar data, the usual documentation, the usual notes, until she reached the part that had made her pause. The DNA entry. Alden Turner. His DNA had been collected posthumously, a standard procedure after an arrest for a domestic violence charge he had faced in 2016. But the man was dead. How was this possible? Ava's mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. There had been no new developments in the case since the initial investigation back in 1972. It was another cold case, a missing persons file buried beneath decades of paperwork. But now the trail had resurfaced, and it was leading straight back to a man long buried in the past. Why? What did this match mean? Why hadn't Turner been caught before? He'd had a long criminal history, but somehow the pieces had never quite connected. Ava scrolled through his file. There was no clear motive, no obvious reason that Alden Turner, who had been a petty criminal at best, would have anything to do with Ella Monroe's disappearance. Her mind worked through the layers. She quickly pulled up the original case files, the witness statements, the reports, the photographs of Ella's bike found abandoned in a field. The more she looked at the evidence, the more confused she became. She found herself scrolling through the photos of Ella's blue Schwinn bicycle, the abandoned backpack, the schoolbook strewn carelessly across the gravel road. Ava clicked on the crime scene photos that had been taken in 1972. Ella's torn jacket, the stray fabric, the pieces of evidence that were now part of the cold case. What had they missed all these years? As she stared at the images, something began to form in her mind. How could a match like this be possible? What Ava didn't know then, what she couldn't have known in that moment, was that this was the start of something far bigger than just a match in the database. This wasn't just the story of a missing girl. This was the story of how technology had changed everything. The DNA report confirmed a conclusive match. Alden Turner's DNA had been found in the fibers of Ella's jacket, the fibers that were collected from the crime scene nearly 56 years ago. It made no sense. But the match, why had it taken so long for the DNA to be discovered? Why hadn't Alden Turner been a suspect back then? Why did this match only appear now, so long after Ella's disappearance? The answers felt just out of reach, and Ava knew this was just the beginning. Why was he never caught? The questions seemed endless, and as Ava sat there staring at the case files, the pieces seemed too small to fit together. She shifted her attention back to the original investigation report, flipping through the pages. Turner had been briefly questioned back in 1972, just a routine interview with the sheriff's department. He had lived only a few miles from where Ella had disappeared, and he was listed as a person of interest in the initial investigation. But there had never been enough evidence to make an arrest. How had they missed this? How had Alden Turner, who had been living in the same area as the missing girl, slipped through the cracks? Ava couldn't help but wonder how the original investigators had missed something as simple as this. There had been no DNA back then. No genetic markers to track down a killer. No way of knowing that this very DNA would solve the case years later. She let out a breath, and for the first time it hit her. This wasn't just about solving a case. It was about the advances in technology. How something so small, so microscopic, could change everything. Alden Turner's criminal history was checked again. Repeated charges, repeated offenses, and yet, somehow, this had all slipped past the authorities. His record was full of violent tendencies, but no one had ever connected those dots. Not until now. In the year before his death, Turner had been arrested multiple times, but his offenses had always been considered minor. His DNA, collected after a 2016 domestic violence arrest, had been entered into the database, but it had sat there, waiting. Ava's mind was racing now. Could this be a fluke, or had this genetic evidence been waiting for this exact moment? She couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to break loose. Ava stared at the screen. The mystery seemed to deepen with each passing second. Why had Turner never been caught? Was he always one step ahead of the law? Was it simply a matter of timing? Ava clicked through to the forensic genealogy report that had brought the match to light. It was the modern-day miracle that was solving cases that had been locked away in the archives for decades. How many cases had gone unsolved simply because the technology wasn't there? How many Alden Turners were walking around, their crimes buried, because the right tools hadn't existed? Ava's fingers hovered above the keys. The match was just the beginning. The real work was about to begin. Finding the answers and unraveling the tangled web of lies, mistakes, and missed opportunities. She couldn't stop thinking about Ella Monroe, the young girl who had disappeared so long ago. The victim, the family, and the truth that had been hiding in plain sight. This wasn't just a breakthrough. This was a moment of reckoning for the entire investigation. Ava wasn't sure what to feel yet, relief, anger, or something else entirely. She knew the answers were just out of reach, but she also knew the next step was crucial. This was a moment of discovery, and now she had to figure out what to do with it. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of something much bigger. Before we dive deeper into the investigation, I just want to take a moment to thank all of my amazing subscribers who have been with me through every twist and turn of these stories. Your support is what keeps this channel growing, and it means the world to me. Producing these stories takes a lot of time and effort, and without your encouragement, I wouldn't be able to bring these chilling, real-life cases to light. If this story has captivated you, if you're already on the edge of your seat, like this video to show your support. Subscribe to the channel so you can keep following the incredible breakthroughs in true crime like this. Share this video with someone who still believes that justice is worth fighting for, because every case deserves a voice. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when I drop more unsolved mysteries, shocking revelations, and true crime stories that you won't want to miss. This journey isn't over yet, and I promise, what's coming next is going to leave you speechless. Ella Monroe was just 15 years old when she vanished. A bright, quiet girl from a small town in Michigan, she had been on the path to greatness. She was an honor student at Millbrook High School, loved by teachers and peers alike, always making straight A's, always willing to help a classmate. Her life was full of promise. But one morning in May 1972, that promise was snatched away in an instant. Ella had disappeared. On the morning of May 10th, Ella was riding her bike to school, just like she had every other day for the past few years. Her route was familiar, straight down the dirt road leading from her family's small farm on the outskirts of Greensville, Michigan, to the school she attended in the center of town. It was a path she knew by heart. She'd taken it thousands of times without incident. But this time it was different. The sun had barely risen that morning, casting a soft golden light on the quiet town. There had been no signs of distress, no indications that anything out of the ordinary would happen. Ella had left home as usual, her mother, Helen Monroe, seeing her off at the kitchen door, a quick wave goodbye as Ella pedaled down the long gravel driveway. But as the hours passed, the silence grew louder. By 8 a.m., Ella was expected to arrive at Millbrook High, but she never showed up. At first, it seemed like a simple mistake. Maybe she'd been held up by a friend, or perhaps there was something that had kept her on the way. It wasn't unusual for teens to have a few moments of distraction. But by the time her homeroom teacher called her parents to confirm she had never arrived at school, the reality began to set in. Ella was missing. Helen Monroe was a mother in a small town, where every face was familiar and every child had their routine. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew this was not a situation to ignore. Something was wrong. David Monroe, Ella's father, had been at work on the farm that morning, like he always did. He was a hard-working man, as reliable as the sunrise, always out in the fields, tending to the crops, fixing broken machinery. When he received the call from Helen, asking if he'd seen Ella, he felt his heart drop. There was a sinking sensation in his chest, something he couldn't explain, but he knew the unspoken truth. He immediately stopped everything he was doing. The search began right then. Ella's bicycle was discovered by Dale Morrison, a local farmer, at 11:47 a.m. The bike was just sitting there on the side of the road near County Line 4. Undamaged, its tires still full of air, its chain intact. Her schoolbooks were still neatly arranged in the front basket. It looked like nothing had been touched. There were no signs of a struggle, no sign that anything unusual had occurred. But why hadn't she shown up at school? Why was her bike just abandoned there, in the middle of nowhere? David and Helen Monroe had no answers. They only had questions and fear. The investigation began immediately, but back in 1972, things weren't as simple as they are now. In the early 1970s, forensic science was still in its infancy. There were no DNA tests, no cell phone records to track a missing person's whereabouts. There were no security cameras, no social media posts to trace movements. Investigators didn't have the tools we now take for granted, no digital footprints to follow. All they had were the old-fashioned methods: witness statements, intuition, and a lot of guesswork. The first few days of the search were frantic. Sheriff Douglas Walsh, along with his team of deputies, organized a search party of over 60 volunteers, combing the area around County Line 4, retracing the path that Ella had taken every single day. They knew the terrain well. Flat farmland, open fields, and rolling hills, with long stretches of road bordered by dense cornfields. In some places, the corn stood over 8 feet tall, creating a maze of narrow paths where anyone could disappear from sight without a trace. But despite all their effort, no one found any sign of Ella. No one had seen her after she'd left for school. The search went on for days, but nothing turned up. The lack of evidence was baffling. They had no clue where she could have gone, no clues as to who might have been involved. The only things they had were bits of fabric from her torn jacket found at the crime scene, traces of fibers that would eventually be crucial but meant nothing to anyone at the time. The initial investigative techniques of the 1970s simply weren't enough. The witness statements were conflicting. Some people remembered seeing a man in a pickup truck in the area around the time Ella had gone missing. But no one could remember exactly what the man looked like or offer any specific details about his vehicle. The official investigation went on, but nothing meaningful came to light. Sheriff Walsh did his best, but the tools at his disposal were limited. He couldn't track Ella's movements with any real certainty. There was no way to prove if someone had been following her, no way to even pinpoint where she had disappeared. And so the case began to stagnate. It shifted from an active search to a cold case. A year went by and then another. Helen Monroe, though, never stopped believing her daughter was out there somewhere. She couldn't accept the idea that Ella was simply gone. Gone forever. Her obsession grew. She maintained a frozen image of her daughter in her mind, a girl who had waved goodbye that morning and never returned. Every year, on May 10th, the anniversary of Ella's disappearance, Helen would go to the sheriff's office and file a new report, even though no one had new information to offer. She kept Ella's room exactly as it had been, preserved as though time had stopped on the day Ella left. David Monroe, though, couldn't take it. The constant grief, the daily rituals, the uncertainty. It slowly wore him down. After nearly 19 years of anguish, he passed away, his health deteriorating under the weight of the loss. He died in 1987, heartbroken and never knowing what had happened to his daughter. Helen was left alone with her grief, and Ella's case became her life's work. Fast forward to the present day. Ava Cooper, sitting in front of her computer, now staring at the DNA match between Alden Turner and the fibers from Ella's torn jacket, understood that this wasn't just a case. It was the culmination of a lifetime of unanswered questions, a family's search for the truth, and a mystery that had been buried for decades. Ava knew that she had just uncovered something huge, something that could bring closure to a case that had become a ghost story in the small town of Greensville. But the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. What had happened to Ella Monroe all those years ago? And how had the man who would eventually be identified as her killer slipped through the cracks of an investigation that had stretched for nearly 5 decades? The investigation into Alden Turner would not only bring answers for Ella's family, it would bring justice, long delayed but finally earned. But the real question was, how far would the case go? How deep did this go? And who else had Alden Turner hurt before it was too late to stop him? The more Detective Ava Cooper dug into Alden Turner's history, the more troubling the picture became. What had initially seemed like an isolated incident, one man, one crime, was quickly revealing itself to be a pattern, an unbroken thread of violence, harassment, and unanswered questions that had stretched back decades. Alden Turner wasn't just some random name that had shown up in the system after a routine arrest. He was a man with a history, one that was written in the grief of countless women across Michigan and the surrounding states. 1969, just a year after Ella Monroe had disappeared, marked the first known incident involving Alden Turner. He was just 23 at the time, a man still finding his way in the world, but already showing signs of a darker side. It started small, stalking incidents. A woman named Lisa Morrison, then a waitress in a nearby town, had reported that a man, who she later identified as Turner, had been following her after work. He'd watch her from his truck at night, sometimes pulling up beside her as she walked home. At first, Lisa thought it was harmless, a stranger, maybe even someone she recognized in passing. But when Turner's behavior escalated, she knew something wasn't right. He began showing up at her apartment complex, walking the same route she did, following her every step. The encounters turned frightening. One night, Turner grabbed her from behind as she exited her car, his hands rough and his breath heavy on her neck. Lisa screamed, but he let her go, only to disappear back into the shadows. She reported the incident, but the authorities dismissed it. The evidence was circumstantial. No direct physical proof, no witnesses. Lisa's statement was considered just another complaint in a town full of them. But that wasn't the end of Alden Turner's pattern. It wasn't even close. In fact, his behavior would only escalate in the coming years. Like clockwork, his harassment turned into violent assault. By the mid-1970s, his criminal record began to accumulate. Turner was arrested multiple times for assault, battery, and even attempted abduction, but each time, he seemed to slip away from serious consequences. Investigators were aware of his history, but they never connected the dots. No one could have imagined that his violent tendencies were tied to the disappearances of several young women. Women just like Ella Monroe. Ava's breath caught in her throat as she reviewed the case files. In the years after Ella's disappearance, Turner's violent history had only grown. His attacks began to follow a pattern. Young women, blonde, alone, walking in secluded areas, just like Ella. They never made it to their destinations. And just like Ella, they were gone without a trace. But Turner was always just out of reach. There had been no solid evidence to connect him to any of these cases. Just whispers, hunches, and incomplete investigations. Law enforcement had their hands full. They had no idea they were dealing with someone who was already building a pattern of violence across the Midwest. Then came genetic genealogy, a game-changing technology that had been making waves in law enforcement circles for years. And in this case, it would prove to be the breakthrough Ava Cooper needed. With a match to Ella Monroe's DNA, Turner's name was finally pulled from the depths of old case files and brought into the present. The pieces that had been scattered over decades were beginning to fall into place. Ava's team worked tirelessly through the night. The genetic analysis didn't just stop at one match. It revealed a network of victims, each one's DNA connected to Turner's in the most haunting way. His name began to pop up in several other cold cases that had once seemed unrelated. In 1973, Linda Connors, a 17-year-old from Michigan City, had disappeared while walking home from work. Her case had been closed as a missing persons file. There were no leads, no suspects, no witnesses. But the genetic analysis showed something Ava hadn't expected. Traces of skin cells from Turner's DNA had been found on Linda's clothing. The same fibers that had been present in Ella Monroe's case. Turner had been active all over the Midwest, attacking young women from Illinois to Michigan to Indiana. His crimes weren't isolated. They formed a disturbing pattern that had been lost to time. Lost because the tools to track him simply didn't exist then. But now, with modern forensic techniques, the truth was coming to light. As Ava's team uncovered more evidence, a shocking discovery was made. One that would tie Turner directly to Ella Monroe's disappearance. In a small overgrown shed on Turner's family property, buried deep beneath the floorboards, the team found a metal box. It was old, rusted, and covered in years of dust. But the contents inside would change everything. Inside the box were personal items, belongings that didn't belong to Alden Turner. There were pieces of clothing, jewelry, and photographs, all from young women who had gone missing during the 1970s, all items that had never been connected to any of the open cases. And among them, a vintage brooch, unmistakably belonging to Ella Monroe. The brooch, a gift Ella had received from her mother on her 15th birthday, was unmistakable. Ava held the small, tarnished piece of jewelry in her hand, staring at it in disbelief. It had been buried with everything else that Turner had kept from his victims. Ella's brooch. It was confirmation, the match, the connection, and the final piece of the puzzle that proved Turner's guilt. Ava couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. She'd been investigating cold cases for years, but this discovery hit differently. For the first time, a family would finally get the truth. The Monroe family, who had suffered for decades in silence, would now know what had happened to their beloved daughter. And Turner, though dead, would never escape the consequences of his actions. But as the investigation heated up, emotions ran high. Helen Monroe, Ella's mother, had never stopped searching for her daughter. She had spent years writing letters, visiting authorities, and even contacting psychics, trying to find any clue that could bring Ella back home. It wasn't just about closure anymore. It was about vindication, about the truth finally rising to the surface. But for David Monroe, the reality was more complex. He had passed away many years ago, and the weight of this case had worn him down long before his death. He had been a man who tried to keep his family grounded, but grief had consumed him. And now, years after his passing, his son, Ben Monroe, was forced to relive the loss. He had grown up in the shadow of his sister's disappearance, never knowing peace, always wondering what had happened to his sister. And now he would be forced to confront the truth in a way he had never imagined. Ava sat back in her chair, the brooch still in her hand. The files in front of her were thick, full of case notes, witness statements, and evidence. But they no longer felt like just papers, they felt like a legacy. The work she had done, the work everyone involved had done, was finally coming to fruition. The Monroe family, though torn apart by grief, would now be able to put the puzzle together. And for Alden Turner, though he would never face justice in court, his crimes would never be forgotten. Ava stared at the brooch for a moment longer before making the call. It was time to bring this case to a close, to finally give Ella Monroe the justice she had deserved for so many years. It's starting to get real, isn't it? Alden Turner's history is way darker than anyone realized. How do you feel about the DNA breakthrough connecting him to multiple cases? Would this be a game changer if it had happened earlier? Share your thoughts below. I read every comment and love engaging with all of you. And tell me, where are you watching from? I want to know which part of the world is following this investigation. For Helen Monroe, the years after Ella's disappearance had become a relentless blur of rituals and hope. The kind of hope that flickered in and out, like a candle trying to stay lit in a storm. Every year on May 10th, the anniversary of her daughter's disappearance, she would make the long drive to the sheriff's office in Greensville. It had become her ritual, her dedication to the one thing she could still hold on to, the belief that someone, somewhere might still have the answers. The belief that if she just kept trying, kept fighting, maybe, just maybe, her daughter would be brought home. Helen's obsession with the case had begun soon after that day in May 1972, when Ella simply vanished without a trace. It had started small, with notes written to the local sheriff, to private investigators, to anyone who might know something. Anything that could bring her daughter back. As the years wore on, the letters grew more frantic, filled with theories, suspicions, and wild connections to other missing persons cases in nearby towns. Helen Monroe had become consumed by this search. It wasn't just about finding Ella anymore. It was about making sense of the senseless, about seizing control of the uncontrollable grief. She pored over case files, old newspaper clippings, even reaching out to psychics and amateur sleuths who promised answers that never came. At times, her behavior grew erratic. There were moments of fury and sadness where she would lock herself in Ella's room, surrounded by the things her daughter had left behind. The same schoolbooks, the same ceramic horses on the windowsill. Helen would run her fingers over the covers of the books as if they could bring her daughter back, as if touching the past could somehow fix the present. But as the years passed, that room became less a shrine of hope and more a monument to loss. The bills piled up, the neighbors began to avoid her calls, and the small town of Greensville, once so full of caring faces, now looked at her with pity, with uncertainty. The woman who had been once known for her kindness now became the embodiment of obsessive grief, the woman who couldn't let go. Helen's mental health slowly began to deteriorate. She would see things, hear things. She would stop random people on the street, asking them about Ella, and when they would look at her with blank faces, her frustration would grow. The world didn't care. The world had moved on, and she was left, frozen in time. It wasn't until she got in touch with Ben Monroe, her son, that she began to realize how much she had drowned herself in the search. Ben had been just a boy when Ella disappeared. He had only vague memories of her, of the way she would laugh, the way she would tease him, but those memories were becoming blurred, fading as the years passed. He had grown up with the shadow of his sister's disappearance hanging over him, with his mother becoming more and more obsessed as time went on. After Helen's death, Ben was left with more than just the grief of losing his mother. He was left with the legacy of her obsessive search, the incomplete answers, and the bitter taste of justice that never came. Ben hadn't known his mother had kept so many files, notes, letters, and documents about Ella. When he went through her things after her passing, he found an entire archive of the search meticulously kept, but disjointed, theories, connections, and theories that didn't quite add up. It was overwhelming, like trying to piece together a puzzle with pieces that didn't belong. Ben, however, had something his mother didn't. Focus. Clarity. He had lived most of his life in the shadow of his sister's disappearance. And now, as an adult, he knew this was his chance. He couldn't keep running from it. He had to finish what his mother started, but he couldn't do it alone. The bitterness that had grown in him over the years now propelled him. He found himself reaching out to Detective Ava Cooper, hoping she could offer him the same answers his mother had so desperately sought. As Ava continued to dive into Alden Turner's life, the investigation accelerated. Her focus shifted from the DNA match to Turner's criminal record, and what she discovered shocked her to her core. The more she dug, the more the case seemed to connect with a string of unsolved disappearances from the 1970s. Turner had been living in the same area as Ella Monroe and had been a suspect in other missing persons cases, but the investigations had been sidelined because of his clean record. But as the genetic genealogy reports came in, Ava found herself facing a horrifying reality. The same DNA that connected Turner to Ella Monroe also connected him to several other women who had disappeared over the years. Each of them had a similar physical description. Young, blonde, around the same age as Ella, and they had all vanished without a trace, just like she had. The buried evidence on Turner's property had been the breakthrough. Ava's team had discovered a metal toolbox, tucked away in a corner of Turner's old barn. Inside the box were personal items that didn't belong to him, belongings that had clearly been taken from women, from victims. Among those items was the vintage brooch that Ava recognized immediately. It was Ella Monroe's, the one thing her mother had clung to for so many years. The emotional weight of this discovery hit Ava harder than she expected. She had seen her fair share of cases, but this one felt different. It wasn't just the breakthrough. It was the fact that a family had been left broken for decades, and it was all about to come crashing down with the force of truth. Ben Monroe, who had been quietly observing from the sidelines, had just received the call. It was time for him to step in. Ava knew he had a right to be part of this. Part of his mother's legacy, part of the truth that had eluded them for so many years. The call from Ava felt like a lifeline to him, the answer to all the questions that had plagued him for decades. Ben had spent years repressing his pain, but now it was flooding back. The moment he heard about the DNA match to Turner, the final piece seemed to fall into place. This wasn't just a cold case anymore. This was personal. He had to finish what his mother had started, for her, for Ella, and for himself. The investigation continued to gain momentum. Ava's team had turned up new evidence that connected Alden Turner to several unsolved cases stretching across Michigan, Illinois, and even Indiana. His pattern of behavior, once overlooked, was now crystal clear. Turner had been targeting young women for years, and each case had been brushed aside because no one had connected the dots. But the more they uncovered, the more twisted the story became. Turner's violent behavior didn't just start in the 1970s. It was clear that he had been involved in criminal activity well before then, but the right evidence had never surfaced until now. As Ava and Ben met for the first time, both driven by the same goal, they realized something. Closure wouldn't come easily. Even with all the evidence, even with the breakthroughs in forensic science, justice had eluded them. Ava knew that this case wasn't just about solving a mystery. It was about a family coming to terms with decades of pain. It was about honoring a mother's dedication to a daughter who had been lost. And it was about making sure that the truth finally saw the light of day. As they moved forward, the investigation took on a new urgency. But the emotional toll on the Monroe family had only just begun to reveal itself. And for Ava, that meant the real work was still ahead. Ava stood at the door of the small police station office, the hum of old fluorescent lights flickering above. The room was quiet, save for the rhythmic tapping of her fingers on the desk as she stared at the case file. Ella Monroe's case, now wrapped up in DNA evidence and forensic breakthroughs, was beginning to feel more like a personal mission than just another case. She glanced up from the file as the door opened softly. Ben Monroe walked in, his face drawn and tired from years of silent suffering. The years had carved deep lines around his eyes, and his hair, now speckled with silver, carried the weight of time. He wasn't the young boy who had once been left in the shadow of his sister's disappearance. He was a man, worn by grief and time, but now he was here to do what his mother couldn't finish. He was ready to face the truth, to find the answers that had eluded his family for decades. Ben, I never stopped, you know. Ava looked up, her gaze steady but understanding. Ben had been a part of this case in more ways than just his mother's grief. He had carried the weight of a lost sister and a mother's relentless search that drove her to obsession. But now, as a grown man, it was his turn to seek the answers, the truth that had always hung just out of reach. Ben, I remember the nights, growing up, after she vanished. I remember the way Mom used to sit in the living room, staring at the TV, but I knew her mind was far away, always thinking of Ella. Every year, without fail, she'd go back to the sheriff's office, filing a new report like it might change something. The weight of those words hung in the air. Ben's voice cracked slightly, the decades of unresolved pain creeping through. Ava leaned back in her chair, giving him the space to speak, to open up in a way that most people couldn't. He wasn't just a brother anymore. He was a man in search of closure. Ben, but my mom, she was so sure, so certain that Ella was out there somewhere. And every year, I watched her fall apart a little more, hoping, fighting for a daughter she might never see again. I couldn't let that go on forever. After she died, I knew I had to finish it. I had to know what happened to her, what happened to Ella. The search for answers was never simple. In Ben's case, it wasn't just about finding the truth. It was about restoring the pieces of a life that had been shattered by a loss no one fully understood. Ava knew that Ben wasn't just trying to find out what happened to his sister. He was fighting to reclaim the life his mother had lost, the part of his family history that had been erased. As Ben spoke, Ava felt the sting of his words. He wasn't just a victim of the system. He had been a casualty of time. But time could also be a tool that Ava used to unlock hidden answers in this long-forgotten case. The scene shifted. Reenactment began. Ava's investigation into Alden Turner's past was heating up. She and her team were sitting in the conference room, papers scattered across the table, files, and photographs littered with evidence from the 1960s and 1970s. Turner's criminal record was a labyrinth, one filled with clues, inconsistencies, and opportunities missed. Ava, narrating Turner's life, didn't begin with the disappearance of Ella Monroe. His story, his pattern, began much earlier, with incidents of stalking, harassment, and eventual assault that stretched back to 1969. The most chilling part was the fact that these early incidents had been disconnected, each crime seen as an isolated event, with no clear pattern to link them together. The team was on Turner's old family farm, carefully combing through the barn that had been his sanctuary for decades. The barn was filled with decades of memories, dusty boxes, rusted tools, and old furniture. But it wasn't just about the barn. Ava's team had zeroed in on a metal box buried beneath the barn floor, a relic hidden in plain sight. Inside it were personal items, belongings that didn't belong to Turner, jewelry, pieces of clothing, and photographs of women who had gone missing. It was a treasure trove of victims, and at the bottom of the box, covered in dust, lay the brooch. Ava lifted it carefully, holding the small vintage brooch that had belonged to Ella Monroe. This was the moment, the pivotal moment when everything began to align. Ben, I never wanted to believe it. I didn't want to think that someone like him could have done this. My mom always said it wasn't about revenge. She just wanted to know where Ella was. And now we have answers. His voice cracked as the reality of the situation began to settle in. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to find his sister's belongings buried in Alden Turner's property. He'd always thought, deep down, that there was still a possibility that Ella was alive, that one day they'd find her alive and well. But the discovery of the brooch was confirmation that this case wasn't going to have the happy ending he once dreamed of. The brooch, the proof of Turner's involvement, was a symbol of something greater than just this case. It was the end of a journey that had taken decades. But for Ben, the loss of hope was harder to bear than the loss of his sister. He had to reconcile the idea that his mother's lifelong search had been validated, but at the cost of the truth they had never expected. Ben, it hurts. It hurts knowing she's gone. Knowing she's been gone all this time. But I have to let her go now. I have to accept it. His face was a mix of relief and sorrow, his eyes heavy with emotion as he spoke to Ava, his voice trembling with the weight of the loss he had lived with for decades. But sometimes, closure doesn't come neatly packaged. It doesn't wrap itself in a bow. It's a jagged piece that you have to learn to swallow, no matter how much it hurts. As the investigation continued to unfold, real-time updates started to pour in from the forensic lab. The team had been working relentlessly to gather every possible DNA sample, from Turner's property, from missing women's cases, and from any evidence that could tie Alden Turner to crimes beyond Ella's. Ava, narrating, the breakthroughs kept coming. The DNA match to Turner didn't stop with Ella. It spread like a ripple, touching cases in multiple states. What started as a single connection had grown into a series of shocking revelations, confirming that Alden Turner was responsible for much more than just the disappearance of one young girl. The tension began to build again. Ava's team, now deep into the investigation, was piecing together Turner's dark history. His pattern was clearer than ever. They traced his residences, found witness statements, and uncovered details that confirmed Ava's worst fears. Alden Turner had stalked and attacked other women over the years. Yet, his history was buried, ignored, or dismissed. Law enforcement had failed to connect the dots, had failed to see the bigger picture. Ava, narrating, it was clear now. Turner had been operating under the radar for years, slipping through the cracks, his pattern unnoticed by investigators in the past. But now everything had changed. The pieces fit, the victims had faces, and the trail to justice had been reopened. Ava's work wasn't done, but with each step, she was getting closer. And as Ben Monroe stood beside her, watching the wheels of justice begin to turn, he realized that while they had found the truth, the journey to this point had been longer and harder than anyone could have imagined. The investigation had entered its final phase, but the emotional impact of everything that had been uncovered was far from over. And as they moved forward, Ava knew that the real work, the hard work, was just beginning. We're seeing the emotional side of this investigation really start to unfold. What do you think about Ben and Ava's conversation? Do you believe Ben's emotional journey is similar to what other families go through in these cold cases? Drop your thoughts below. I'm eager to hear from you. The afternoon light filtered through the small windows in the courthouse basement, casting long shadows across the stacks of aging boxes and forgotten files. The air smelled musty, like old paper and dust, the scent of history locked away in corners where no one bothered to look. Ava stood still, her hands resting on the edge of a heavy metal filing cabinet. The cold case files sprawled out before her, the paperwork stacked high and tangled. She had been in and out of this basement a few times already, but something told her that today she would find something that would change everything. For hours, she had been looking through documents, cross-referencing old witness statements and case notes, when something caught her eye. A small, misfiled folder that had slipped behind a pile of administrative paperwork. It was out of place, tucked into a corner, almost as if it had been forgotten deliberately. She pulled it out carefully, the faded label reading, Monroe, Ella, 1972 missing person. It seemed too obvious. How had it been tucked away here, hidden from view? Ava's fingers brushed the corners of the file as she slid it onto the table, her mind already racing with questions. She opened it slowly, not sure what she would find. But she had to know. The first few pages were routine, notes from the initial investigation, witness accounts from the day Ella had disappeared. Then she stumbled upon something unexpected. A witness statement that had been overlooked for years. The statement was from a local man, someone Ava had never come across in the previous records. The man described seeing a white pickup truck near the intersection of County Line 4 on the morning of May 10, 1972, the same day Ella vanished. It wasn't just any truck, it was an exact match to the one Alden Turner had been driving at the time. Ava's pulse quickened. This was something that had never been flagged before. This man had seen the truck parked near the site where Ella's bike had been found. Yet, for reasons Ava couldn't immediately understand, this crucial lead had never been investigated. Ava, narrating, why hadn't this been followed up on? Why was it buried with all these other files? As she read on, Ava found something even more troubling. A witness interview, filed under uncategorized reports, showed that Alden Turner had been briefly questioned by a deputy shortly after Ella's disappearance. The deputy had apparently arrived at Turner's property the same day Ella's bike was found, but instead of taking a closer look, the deputy had dismissed him, thinking he was just another local farmer with no connection to the case. Turner had provided a weak alibi. He claimed to have been working on his farm equipment that morning. The deputy had taken no further action, and the file showed no follow-up. Ava's heart skipped a beat. Alden Turner, the man whose DNA was now a match to the fibers found on Ella's torn jacket, had been right under their noses in 1972, and yet he had been let go with no further questions. How could the case have been allowed to slip through their fingers like this? Ava, narrating, this was it. This was the moment everything changed. This was where the case should have ended, but instead, it became just another cold file. The scene shifted to 1972, the day after Ella's disappearance. Sheriff Walsh, an experienced lawman, had sent his deputies out to canvass the area, questioning anyone they could find. Alden Turner's name had come up in conversation, but his brief interview had led nowhere. The deputy who had spoken with him had noted in the report that Turner seemed nervous but offered a convincing alibi. At the time, Turner was just another local with no criminal background. No reason to think he might be involved in the disappearance. And so, he was dismissed. Ava, narrating, in 1972, Alden Turner was just a name on a list of possible suspects, someone who had been questioned but never seriously considered. And in that moment, when the sheriff's department decided to let him go, the trail went cold. Ava sat in the dimly lit room, staring at the file. The implications were huge. This misfiled folder had revealed a fatal mistake, one that had allowed Turner to walk free and continue his reign of terror for years. The interview had been there, right from the start, a crucial link that had never been followed up on. Ava's mind raced. What if? What if Turner had been caught back then? What if the investigation had taken a different path? Could Ella Monroe have been saved? Could the other women who had disappeared over the years been protected? The questions flooded her mind, each one darker than the last. A single mistake. One misfiled document. That's all it had taken for Alden Turner to slip through the cracks. If this file had been reviewed, if the deputy had pressed harder on Turner's alibi, if the case had been connected to the other disappearances sooner, things could have been different. Sheriff Walsh, sitting at his desk, reviewing the reports from the previous day. The deputy who had interviewed Turner stood in front of him, offering a final assessment. He didn't press Turner too hard, figuring the farmer's alibi was solid enough. There had been other leads to follow, other witnesses to interview. So Turner was allowed to go free. A single choice, a moment of inattention, and everything shifted. Ava leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. Alden Turner had been right there, right under their noses. He had been questioned, but the investigation had moved on. That mistake had allowed him to continue his pattern of violence. And now, decades later, it had all come rushing back in the form of DNA, buried evidence, and misfiled paperwork. Ava couldn't help but wonder how many other cases had been lost in the same way. How many turning points had gone unnoticed? How many people had been left in the dark because of a single missed opportunity? The weight of the discovery was heavy, but she knew one thing for sure. Turner had finally been caught, even if it had taken far too long. Ava narrating, what if? What if Turner had been caught back then? What if the investigation had gone differently? So many women, So many lives could have been saved. Ben Monroe's face flashed in her mind. She thought about how he had lived with the absence of answers for so long. How his mother had never let go of the belief that Ella was out there, somewhere. The pain of never knowing. The frustration of false leads, dead ends, and unanswered questions. Ben had been forced to carry his family's legacy of grief, the burden of truth that had remained buried in that forgotten file. Ava narrating, but now, the truth was out. The question was no longer why Turner wasn't caught earlier. The question was what could be done now to make sure the families of these victims finally received justice. Ava quickly flipped through the newly discovered files again, her eyes catching something she hadn't seen earlier. A file number that matched another cold case from nearby. The same year. The same pattern. A woman, blonde, 17, had vanished from a neighboring town. The case had gone cold too, but this new piece of evidence, Turner's DNA, was beginning to connect the dots between the two disappearances. Could this be the beginning of uncovering even more victims? Was Turner's network of crimes larger than anyone had ever imagined? The tension began to build again. Ava felt herself bracing for the next step in the investigation, because the journey wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The mistakes of the past had been uncovered, and now it was time to set the record straight. To make sure that Turner was finally brought to justice for all of his victims. Ava, narrating, justice may have taken too long to come, but now it was time for the victims to be heard, for the families to be given the truth, for the case to be closed once and for all. Helen Monroe's grief had long since crossed the line between mourning and madness. The loss of Ella, her only daughter, had fractured her mind in ways no one could have predicted. In the early days after Ella's disappearance, there was still hope. It was the kind of hope that kept a person going, the kind that propelled a mother to wake up every morning and continue her search, even when every lead turned out to be a dead end. But as the years passed, that hope became obsession, an obsession that slowly consumed her. Helen had once been the heart of the Monroe family, a loving, compassionate woman who had cared for everyone around her. But now, the search for Ella had become her everything. And as time wore on, the line between reality and delusion began to blur. The mother who had once been the glue that held her family together was now a shell of herself. Grieving, desperate, and increasingly unhinged. It wasn't just the normal grief. No, Helen's grief was something more intense, more consuming. She spent hours each day combing through newspaper clippings, writing endless letters to private investigators, psychics, and anyone who might have a clue. She began convinced that a network of criminals was involved in her daughter's disappearance. She couldn't make sense of it. Couldn't accept the idea that her daughter was gone forever. So instead, she connected the dots in ways no one else could see. Helen wrote pages of theories that seemed irrational to anyone else, but to her, they were truth. She believed that a vast network of people was responsible for the abductions of young girls all across the Midwest. She clung to the idea that someone had taken Ella, someone had hidden her away, and it was just a matter of finding the right trail to follow. She sent letters to the FBI. She sent letters to the police. She even reached out to strangers online, people who were just as obsessed with unsolved crimes as she was. Her ideas grew more elaborate, more complicated, until they seemed like a conspiracy theory spiraling out of control. But none of it brought her any closer to finding Ella. Helen's mind became trapped in a cycle of unanswered questions and false hope. Every anniversary, every moment of silence, was another reminder that her daughter was gone, and yet she refused to accept it. Her husband, David, tried to help her, but it became clear that nothing could break through the wall she had built around herself. The man who had once been strong, the man who had held the family together, found himself watching his wife slowly unravel. He was helpless, standing by as his wife spiraled deeper into obsession and delusion. He had to live in the shadow of his own broken heart, but the grief that weighed him down was nothing compared to what Helen endured. David's silence was his way of coping, while Helen's voice was consumed by the same question over and over again: where is Ella? Ava knew the psychological toll Helen had endured. It wasn't just the loss of a child, it was the sense of injustice, of something unresolved, gnawing at the edges of her soul, eating away at her mind. Ava had seen it before. Families left behind by unsolved cases. Some were able to move on. Others, like Helen, became trapped by the past, unable to move forward. The desire for closure can be powerful, but when that closure isn't possible, it can turn into something much darker. In one of the many rooms of her home, Helen sat surrounded by stacks of paper, photographs, and maps, a chaotic collage of theories that stretched across her living room. There were pins on the walls, with red strings connecting dots, each thread representing another possible lead. Some were clear. Others were faint connections, nothing but a series of loose ends. But Helen couldn't stop. She wouldn't. Ella's voice, in her mind, whispered to her every night. It wasn't just about finding her daughter anymore. It was about proving that the world had failed her. Helen would sit there at night, poring over the files, muttering to herself, as if the answers were hidden in the tiniest details. She would talk to the walls, asking the questions no one had answers to. She would pace back and forth, stopping only to scribble down a new connection she had made, ignoring the reality of what was happening to her. And as the years dragged on, that hope turned into something darker, a desperation that twisted her once loving nature into something unrecognizable. Alden Turner was a man driven by a different set of demons. His violent tendencies began early, but they were subtle at first. The first signs were the harassing behaviors, the stalking, the unwanted attention he gave to young women. But as the years passed, his impulses grew more dangerous. Turner didn't just want to control. He wanted to dominate. Ava, narrating Turner's violence, escalated over time, from stalking to assault, to outright abductions. But there was something even darker lurking beneath the surface. Turner wasn't just fixated on these women. He was obsessed with power, with control. He preyed on vulnerability, on young women who were isolated, easy targets in the quiet rural communities. And when he crossed that line, when the fantasy became reality, his crimes became more calculated, more brutal. In Turner's criminal history, Ava found reports of escalating violence. His early offenses were dismissed, just the actions of a young man who had been in trouble with the law. But each crime became more violent, more deliberate. In his mid-20s, Turner had been arrested for assault, for breaking and entering, and for attempted kidnapping. But he always managed to evade serious consequences. His ability to blend into the fabric of the small town was part of what made him so dangerous. People never saw him coming. As the years passed, his crimes became more brazen. No longer just the random attacks on women, but a pattern of deliberate choices. Turner didn't just target any woman. He sought young girls, often around the same age as Ella. His need for control was all-consuming. He learned to manipulate the system, using his status in the small town to stay under the radar. Alden Turner stood over a young woman, his face twisted with anger, his hands gripping the familiar fabric of her clothes. He had been stalking her for weeks now, watching her every move. She had no idea she was being followed. She was just another target, just another name on his growing list. He had been here before. He knew what he was doing. He knew exactly how far he could push before someone would stop him. But no one ever did. And for that reason, he kept coming back time and time again, until his violence turned to murder. For Turner, the violence was about assertion. He didn't see his victims as people. They were objects, pawns in a game of power and control. Each attack made him feel more invincible, more confident in his ability to slip past the law. And every time he got away with it, he grew bolder. And every time a piece of him died inside, because the more power he took, the emptier he became. For Ben Monroe, the psychological toll was far different. He had grown up in the shadow of his sister's disappearance, and even now, as an adult, he still couldn't shake the feeling of loss. He had lived his entire life without closure, without the certainty that his family could move forward. And now, after his mother's death, it was finally his turn to uncover the truth. Ben had spent his entire life wondering where his sister had gone, if she had been alive for all these years, if she had suffered, or if she had been taken and hidden away. That uncertainty had eaten away at him for decades. But now, with each new discovery Ava and her team made, Ben was forced to confront the truth. Ella wasn't just missing, she had been taken, and she was never coming back. But even with the truth in hand, Ben still couldn't help but feel the weight of the years that had been lost, the years of suffering his mother had endured, and the suffering his family had carried in silence. This wasn't just about finding a body, it was about healing, about breaking the cycle of pain that had followed them for so long. The room fell into an almost eerie silence after the weight of the discovery settled in. Ella Monroe's case, once a distant mystery, now stood at the forefront of a story long buried in pain, confusion, and frustration. The answers had finally arrived, but they didn't come without a cost. Ben Monroe, standing in front of the recovered brooch, the symbol of a lost sister, took a deep breath. The reality of the truth was almost too heavy to bear, and yet, it was the only thing that could finally heal the wounds that had festered for so long. As Ava Cooper closed the case file, her heart heavy with the knowledge that justice, though bittersweet, was being served, she couldn't help but think of the questions that remained. What if? What if Alden Turner had been stopped earlier? What if this case had been connected sooner, the evidence pieced together before the trail grew cold? What if better communication, better resources, and better forensic science had been available when Ella first vanished? The Monroe family was finally receiving the truth they'd been searching for, but the question remained: how many other families were still waiting for their answers? How many cold cases had slipped through the cracks of incomplete investigations, missed connections, and outdated technology? This case wasn't just about solving a single mystery. It was about learning from the past and transforming the way we approach cold cases moving forward. The role of modern forensic science, the advent of DNA technology, and the power of genetic genealogy have reshaped the future of criminal investigations, but there's still so much to be done. The question is, could this tragedy have been prevented earlier? Could there have been better communication between law enforcement agencies across jurisdictions? Could more time-sensitive action have saved the lives of others like Ella? Ben stood there, his face a mixture of relief and sorrow, as he looked at the brooch. It was proof, not only of Ella's tragic fate but of the flaws in a system that allowed one man to slip through the cracks for so many years. But for him, the hardest part wasn't finding the truth. It was living with it. The pain of knowing his sister was gone, and the anger at how close Turner had come to being caught earlier, weighed heavily on him. Ben, narrating, "It's hard to say what could have been done differently. All I know is this: law enforcement agencies need to communicate. They need to share information across county lines, across state borders. If they had worked together, if they had connected the dots earlier, maybe the pain wouldn't have lasted so long." As Ben Monroe's journey toward closure comes to a close, we can't forget that this case, this story, could have gone differently. Better communication between agencies, more interjurisdictional collaboration, and a stronger focus on DNA technology could have brought this story to its end decades earlier. And while it may feel like the case is closed, the truth is, this is only the beginning of rethinking how we solve crimes in the 21st century. Now, it's time for you to step in and reflect on what you think. Take a moment and ask yourself, what could have been done differently to stop Alden Turner's crimes earlier? Do you think better communication between law enforcement agencies, sharing information, coordinating efforts across county and state lines, could have stopped him before he hurt more innocent women? Could this case have been solved in 1972, when the pieces were there, but the technology wasn't? Share your thoughts below. We want to hear what you think. This is a conversation we need to keep having. How we can prevent tragedies like this from continuing. How DNA science and forensic genealogy are changing the way we approach cold cases. And how we can demand better accountability from agencies working in isolation. If this story resonated with you, if you've been captivated by how modern forensic science is finally bringing justice to the victims, subscribe. Follow us as we dive deeper into more true crime stories, where answers are finally coming to light, and families are finding closure they've waited for, sometimes for decades. Ella Monroe's case was solved, but there are still so many stories out there waiting to be uncovered. Families waiting for justice. Forensic science is changing everything, but it's only effective when everyone is working together. The question is, are we doing enough? If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true crime stories like Ella's. Hit the bell so you never miss a story, and join us as we continue to uncover the mysteries that still haunt us. Because the truth is out there, waiting to be found. Thanks for watching. Ava and Ben meet at the police station, where Ben is shown the recovered evidence that conclusively links Alden Turner to the disappearance of Ella Monroe, including the key item, the vintage brooch. Grief is a complex thing. It doesn't adhere to a timetable. It doesn't wait for the right moment. Instead, it circles back, creeping up on you when you least expect it. For Ben Monroe, grief had been a companion for decades. Silent, pervasive, and heavy. His sister Ella had disappeared when he was just a boy, and in the years that followed, that loss became the center of his existence. The emptiness left behind was something no one could fill. But for Ben, the pain wasn't just in Ella's absence. It was in the not knowing. Not knowing where she was. Not knowing why she had been taken. It wasn't until his mother's death that Ben finally felt the urge to uncover the truth. His mother, Helen Monroe, had been consumed by the search for Ella. Helen's grief had driven her to obsess, to look for answers no one else seemed able to find. And in that journey, Ben had become a shadow, watching his mother fight a battle that was so deeply personal, he couldn't understand it at the time. As the years wore on, Ben had found himself trapped in the shadow of her grief. He grew up lost, not just in the absence of his sister, but in the silence that surrounded his mother's unrelenting search. The endless theories, the letters to private investigators, the frantic phone calls to authorities. All of it had weighed on him. He had never known his mother without her fight, without her obsession to find the answers. But now, as an adult, Ben was beginning to understand. He had always believed that he could never find peace unless he found Ella. And even now, standing at the edge of discovery, Ben realized the truth. Closure doesn't come easily. It wasn't just about finding Ella. It was about finally understanding the magnitude of everything his mother had suffered. And it wasn't just about the truth for his family. It was about understanding what had been lost, what they'd all lost. Ben thought back to the early days after Ella's disappearance. He was just a boy then, trying to understand a world that had suddenly become chaotic and unpredictable. His mother, a woman once full of life, had been swallowed by the mystery of Ella's vanishing. Every morning, his mother would sit at the kitchen table, pen in hand, writing letters to anyone who might help. To private detectives, to psychics, to authorities. Anyone who could give her a glimmer of hope, anything to make the inexplicable make sense. Ben, reflecting, I was too young to understand. Too young to see how it was all consuming her. I remember her searching over and over again, like something in her soul had become obsessed with finding the answers. But me. I was just a kid. I didn't get it. I didn't get why she couldn't just let it go. Why she couldn't move on. I never realized the toll it took on her. Not until later, when I had to carry it for myself. Ben's voice, though quiet now, echoed the deep longing of his soul. He had repressed his grief for so many years. He had lived in the shadow of his mother's obsession, a silent observer, trying to hold his own life together while his mother's unraveling continued in silence. But now he had to step into the light, into a role he hadn't anticipated. The one who would finally bring the answers home. The truth was buried deep within layers of files, misfiled documents, and forgotten evidence. But with the DNA breakthrough and the discoveries in Alden Turner's past, Ben now had the chance to honor the years of his mother's work, and to find Ella, even if only in spirit. As Ava Cooper sat with Ben Monroe, she could see it in his eyes, the heavy weight of decades of grief. The questions that had haunted him for years were now inching closer to answers. They were finally on the verge of closure, but it was clear that Ben was still struggling. He had lived with the uncertainty of Ella's disappearance for too long. The trauma of that empty void, the years of wishing and waiting, had taken its toll on him. Ava, now fully immersed in this case, understood that more than ever. This wasn't just about the crime. It was about the lives destroyed along the way. Ben's life, Helen's life, and even Ava's own connection to the case. Ben, softly, she didn't deserve this, you know? Ella didn't deserve to be taken, and neither did Mom. I never thought about it this way. How she kept searching, how she couldn't let go. But now I know. Ava nodded, acknowledging the weight of his words. Ella Monroe's case had fractured a family, had torn apart the very fabric of their lives, and it wasn't just the crime that was the tragedy. It was what happened after, the way grief had consumed their every waking moment, the way unanswered questions had shaped their existence. As Ava continued her investigation into Turner's life, it became clear to her that this case was about more than just finding a perpetrator. It was about unraveling the story of a man who had been allowed to continue his reign of terror for decades, unchallenged. But more than that, it was about understanding why Turner had chosen to hurt these young girls in the first place. What had driven him to target them? What had turned him from a man with a clean record into a serial predator who moved across state lines, whose DNA linked him to not just Ella, but several other women whose lives had been torn apart? Ava knew that Turner's motives, whatever they might be, were deeply rooted in his own psychological scars, in his ability to blend in, to play the role of the harmless neighbor, the lonely farmer. But the truth was far more chilling. Turner's history, his escalating violence, his stalking, his obsession with control, all pointed to a man who had never been caught, never been held accountable. He had lived in the shadows, knowing that no one was looking. And it wasn't until Ava and Ben's relentless search that the truth finally came to light. As Ava and Ben met at the police station for the final time, they had only one thing left to do: look at the evidence that would finally close the door on this case. The vintage brooch, the item that had belonged to Ella, the item that had been buried for decades, was the final piece in the puzzle. Ella's truth, after all this time, was now finally within their grasp. As Ben Monroe took the brooch in his hand, he felt the weight of everything that had come before it. The years of unanswered questions, the frustration, the pain of knowing his sister was lost, and his mother was consumed by the need to find her. But now, the final piece of the puzzle was in his hands. The brooch was proof. Proof that his mother's search had not been in vain. Proof that Ella was real, that she had lived, and that her memory would never be lost again. Ben, softly, this is hers. This is the only piece of her left. After all these years, this is all we have. It wasn't just a case anymore. It was a story of loss, of a family's fight to hold on, to find peace in a world that didn't give it easily. And as Ben Monroe closed his eyes, holding that brooch in his hand, he knew the journey wasn't truly over. He had found the truth, but the healing would come slowly. The truth had been uncovered, and for the first time in decades, the Monroe family could finally breathe. Ella Monroe, a young girl with a future ahead of her, whose life was tragically cut short, now had her story told. The truth of her life, her disappearance, and the justice she deserved was finally being recognized. This case, which had once seemed like an unsolvable mystery, had become a tribute to resilience. The resilience of a family that never gave up, and the resilience of a system that eventually, though too late, provided answers. As we close this chapter, we remember Ella. Her family's fight, her mother's endless search, and the legacy of pain that has finally been transformed into justice. Ella Monroe will not be forgotten. And here we are at the end of another journey together. But before we wrap up, I just want to take a moment to say thank you to all of you, my incredible subscribers. Your support is what fuels this channel, and these stories take time, effort, and a lot of dedication to bring to you. You've helped me bring closure to these unsolved cases and give a voice to those who were left unheard for so long. Thank you for believing in the power of truth. If this case has shocked you, if you feel like it deserves to be heard by more people, like this video to show your support for these stories. Subscribe so you don't miss out on more true crime breakthroughs like this one. Share this video with someone who still believes there's justice for every victim, because we can't let these stories be forgotten. And, as always, Turn on the notification bell so you can be the first to know whenever I release the next heart-pounding mystery. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for what comes next.